Welcome, everyone. Hello. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm Chris Banks. I'm a local poet with 5 published books and a sometimes contributing editor to the New Quarterly. Welcome to our 9th annual The Wild Writers Festival and the workshop Placing the Perfect Line Break with Paul Vermeersch. I've known Paul for over 20 years, and he's done everything young Paul Vermeersch said he was going to do. He is an editor with Walzack and Wynn Publishers. He's a fine poet in his own right, who has recently released his new and selected poems, Shared Universe, in the fall with ECW Press. He's a college professor in the publishing program at Sheridan College. But more importantly, Paul is a tireless supporter of new poets and new poetry. He finds new talent and helps young writers shape poems into books. I hope you enjoyed the workshop Placing the Perfect Line Break, as Paul Vermeersch has much experience and much knowledge to share with us tonight. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you to Wild Writers for inviting me to do this workshop. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm pleased to see that we have 106 participants in today's workshop. Much of the workshop tonight is going to be some PowerPoint slides that I've prepared for you. I will be talking, of course. I know that some of you have submitted some questions in advance of tonight's workshop, and I think most of those I will save till the end, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for a bit of a Q&A. And periodically throughout the workshop, I'll stop to make sure that we have time to ask questions sort of along the way if anyone needs clarification about anything that I'm talking about. So without further ado, I am going to walk us through some of the basics about sort of the poetic line and how it breaks, and we'll get more and more technical as we move along, and we'll have some examples of texts to look at, some of which I have created as merely as exemplars, and then some poems by other poets that we'll look at to see what they're doing. And let's get started, because we've got less than an hour now to work through this material. So welcome one and all to Placing the Perfect Line Break. I'm very pleased to be here. And the first thing that many of you might want to know, and some of you probably already have a good idea of, is what is the poetic line? And as far as I'm concerned, the line is the basic building block of making a poem. It consists of all the words that occupy the same horizontal space on a page read in order, which seems pretty basic, but that can actually be a very complex thing. Lines of poetry exist because of the way we read, and by extension, the way we place words or type on a page in order to be read. Typesetting creates the line. Composition creates the line. Syntax does not create the line. Grammar does not create the line. A line then is defined or delineated by its form, not by its grammar or its syntax. Meaning does not create a line, but a line can create or alter meaning. And we're going to have some examples that will demonstrate this a little later on in the workshop. Something that I believe in is that every line in a poem should begin where it begins and end where it ends for a reason. And so when I'm writing a poem and when I'm editing the poems of others, I spend a lot of time thinking about where lines begin and end, and if those are the optimal places for them to begin and end. And I believe that an arbitrary line break, that is a line break that does nothing because it wasn't placed there with purpose, is a sloppy line break. So let's begin with looking at the different kinds of line breaks. I know that one of the questions that was submitted in advance of tonight's workshop asked me to talk a little bit more about caesuras. So let's start there. Caesurae are breaks within a line, signified by punctuation or space. There are three basic kinds of caesurae, and since caesurae are breaks that take place within a line, I think it's important to include them and remember that a line break or a break in a line doesn't always come at the end of the line. Sometimes it comes in the middle. So we have an initial caesurae, and these are found near the beginning of the line. I have written an example. Behold, this line has an initial caesura. And that behold with an exclamation mark automatically makes us pause before the beginning of the next sentence. And that might remind you of the beginning of Beowulf, for example. Many of you may have read Beowulf or started to read Beowulf. Seamus Heaney's famous first line in his translation of Beowulf is, "So, the Spear Danes in days gone by," and there's that "so" with a period. Other translators have translated as, "Hail, we have heard the tales sung of the Spear Danes," or "What? We of the Spear Danes in days of yore." But it's always a translation of what appears in the original text, the word "whet" with an exclamation point. That initial caesurae sort of serves to call to attention, and it's often used that way. The medial caesura is found in the middle of the line. The example I've written is, "Here's a medial caesurae, now keep reading." And the terminal caesura is found near but not at the end of the line. Looking for a terminal caesura here. And so these are the three types of caesurae. And why are they used? There's many reasons to have a pause in the middle of the line. It can be to create emphasis, like that initial caesura, to call to attention, to pause for breath, but more than anything, caesurae are used to measure. They are used to create pacing. They are used to slow down the thinking and to therefore attract attention to or emphasize things that may be in that line and create rhythm or interrupt rhythm, as the case may be. And I think we'll find this with a lot of line breaks. And that brings us to end stop lines. And my thinking around end stop lines is often a bit more, I think, intricate than the way they're usually defined. An end stop line is usually defined as a line that ends with any sort of punctuation. Or if punctuation is absent, a line that reads as though the syntax comes to a natural conclusion at the end of the line. But as we will see as we move forward, this definition may not be enough. In practice, end stop lines can have a visual effect, a sonic effect, or both. More on this in a minute, but I'm going to want to draw attention to how we understand text often differently by seeing it and by hearing it. And as poetry is both a written and a verbal art form, I think it's important to look deeply at and discuss how line breaks can function differently for the eye and the ear, depending on the situation, depending on the text. So we'll be looking at that carefully. Self-enclosed lines are a subset of end stop lines. They tend to follow proper grammar and syntax. So the end of the line comes logically where a sentence might end. That is, the whole line is a sentence. For example, from Shakespeare's famous sonnet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? One line, one sentence, self-enclosed. Or a self-enclosed line may be more than one sentence, so long as they are enclosed within one line, like the famous schoolyard rhyme, I see Paris, I see France, I see ladies' underpants. You could write that as one line, or you could have a line break after France, and they would still be two sets of self-enclosed lines. And we will talk about why self-enclosed lines and end stop lines are useful in a moment. But the final type of line break are enjambed lines. And enjambment is when the sense and syntax of the line continues beyond the end of the line, leading the reader's eye and ear into the next line, ideally without the sense that the syntax of the line has come to an end. So there's a propulsion. With a good enjambment, will propel the reader into the next line. It will be clear at the end of that line that the sense and syntax of that line has not ended, and you will naturally want to start reading the next line without pausing. This doesn't always work that way with enjambed lines, and we will soon come to a similar understanding as with end stop lines, that they can work differently for the eye and the ear depending on the text. So like end stop lines, enjambed lines can have a visual effect, a sonic effect, or both. And now is the time where I will pause for questions. Right now, I'm looking for questions of clarity about any of the terminology that I've used so far. So I am going to look into the Q&A here to see if there are any more any questions to be answered at this time. I don't see any new questions here at the moment. And I'll just check the chat as well. No new questions. Okay, so we are ready to move on. Someone has asked, will you talk about how line breaks function differently for eye and ear? Absolutely, we're getting to that. Okay. We will get to that. Moving on. So, as an example, let's first look at the first stanza of Wallace Stevens' poem, Anecdote of the Jar. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. Now, you will have heard how I paused naturally at the end of Tennessee and at the end of the word hill, but how at the end of the word wilderness, there was less of a pause, and I sort of moved into that final line a bit more quickly. And that's because I know that there's an enjambment at the end of that line, because there's no punctuation, but also because I can see that the sentence continues onto the next line. Now, that's with me reading it. Hearing these lines, I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness. If I didn't get into that last line right away, it made the slovenly wilderness, one might assume that that line is self-contained. It made the slovenly wilderness. Made in the sense of fabricating it or producing it, rather than forcing it to do something, forcing it to surround the hill. So if we break this down, I placed a jar in Tennessee. This is an end-stopped line, even though the syntax continues on to the next line. There's a comma instead of a period. That comma tells you there's the sound of the line comes to an end, but the syntax, the sense of the line, continues into the next line. That second line, and round it was upon a hill, is also an end-stopped line. And the period tells you the syntax does not continue into the next line. It stops both for the eye and the ear. It made the slovenly wilderness is enjammed to the eye because we see there is no punctuation, like there was punctuation in the first two lines. But it may be ambiguous to the ear if there's an audible pause, because we could possibly potentially understand it made the slovenly wilderness as its own self-enclosed line, which it isn't. And then the final line, which is a continuation of the syntax of the previous line, surround that hill, is an end-stopped line. Mostly this works very well, though there is that potential for a misunderstanding with the third line. And this is not a criticism of Wallace Stevens' work. His work is beyond reproach as far as I'm concerned, but it makes a handy example of how we might want to be vigilant about where we place enjambments and end stop lines in our own work to avoid any confusion. And I don't actually think that there's much confusion here, although there could be. Now let's look at the first stanza of Audre Lorde's poem, Who Said It Was Simple? There are so many roots to the tree of anger that sometimes the branches shatter before they bear. And I emphasize the line breaks a little bit for the sake of illustration. But here's an instance where the traditional definition of end stop lines may not suffice. The first two lines are syntactically enjambed. They don't end with any punctuation, but they may sound at first listen end stopped to the ear. Listen again. There are so many roots to the tree of anger. Hearing this poem read aloud only and not looking at the text, we might, by listening, understand that to be a self-enclosed line. There are so many roots to the tree of anger, period. We may hear a period there, but we don't see one. The next line comes in and we understand that it to be a continuation, that sometimes the branches shatter. And again, just hearing this poem and not seeing it, we may understand that to be an end stopped line as well. But it isn't. Before they bear is the last line. So each of these lines sounds like it could be an end stopped line. And then the next line picks up the sense of syntax and it continues until at the third line, there is an actual end stop line. But what does this dichotomy create? Here's a very good example of lines that look enjambed and sound end stopped. They're working differently for the eye and the ear. And I'm not saying that Audre Lorde has done this sloppily or that she didn't intend this. I absolutely believe that she intended this and that this is creating an effect. But what effect is that? What is she doing here? So here's the question. If one of the main reasons for having an enjambed line is to continue the sense and syntax of the line beyond its end, thus propelling the reader's attention to the next line without pause, what is the point of having enjambed lines that sound like end-stop lines that suggest a pause? And I think that's absolutely what Audre Lorde is doing in these three lines, is she is suggesting a very strong pause at the end of these first two lines. And is forcing you to consider the meaning of each line and then adding to it, and then adding to it again. So line breaks prevent you from reading the way you would read prose. They break up reading. They break reading up into smaller units that will require our attention in different ways, and they slow down reading. Reading poetry is a much slower way of reading often than reading prose. And so line breaks can create or reinforce the rhythms of speech or written language, dictate pacing, suggesting speed or sluggishness or stasis. And line breaks can encourage reflection, create emphasis, highlight multiple intended meanings or readings of the text, provide clarity, or sow confusion. And I believe what Audre Lorde was doing in those 3 lines is highlighting multiple intended meanings or meanings or readings of the text, slowing us down so that we consider each building block in the opening of her poem as both a standalone thought and as part of a larger thought. So whether a line employs caesuras, end stops, is self-enclosed or enjambed, a line break enhances the meanings of the words themselves. Whereas a sentence is a syntactical unit of meaning, meaning derived from the punctuation, a poetic line is a rhythmic unit of meaning, and its meaning is derived from its form. And I'm going to pause here again for any questions that may require clarity. I'm going to open this Q&A window again, and just bear with me while I read here. Some of these are questions I will leave till the end. Someone is asking about the use of capital letters, like the capital letter for surround in the Wallace Stevens poem. It is an older convention to begin each line of verse with a capital letter. It is a convention left over from mostly from 17th and 18th century typesetters. And it is a convention that Wallace Stevens retained well into his career as a poet, but it is a convention that has more or less fallen out of favor through as the 20th century sort of labored on. It was still sort of used widely by early modernist poets like Stevens. And then by the time we get to whippersnappers like E. E. Cummings and everything after that, saving those initial capital letters for each line fell out of favor. And someone asked, can enjambment work without punctuation? Absolutely. We'll certainly talk more about punctuation at the end. Can you explain the difference between end stop and end or final caesura? A terminal caesura, an end stop is at the end of the line, and a terminal caesura is a pause in the line that occurs near but not at the end of the line. So caesura is always a pause within the line. So a terminal caesura happens near but not at the end of the line. And then some of these questions we'll save till the end. We'll talk about capital letters perhaps at the end. Someone asked, is it considered pretentious to pronounce enjambment in a French accent? I've never heard it. I've never heard it pronounced that way. So I actually don't have an opinion on that. That's how you would like to pronounce it. It's okay with me. Someone asked, if you have a second line as an added line of meaning to the first, is that considered a standalone meaning too? It depends on the composition. In the Audre Lorde example that I gave, I would say no. I would say it just changes the meaning or adds to the meaning of the first line, but I don't think it stands on its own. And so someone's asking about indentations. We're going to get to, we do have to move on. I do want to get to all of your questions, but I think some of them we will need to address at the end. So someone wanted to see that last slide one more time. And let's move on. So look at this sentence. The old man the boat. The old man the boat. Does that sound like a sentence? Or does that sound like a sentence fragment? I'll tell you that it is a sentence, but it is a confusing sentence. It is a sentence that requires clarity. Will a line break offer clarity? The old man, the boat. I think this line break does not offer any clarity to this sentence. The old man, the boat. Still doesn't seem to make sense as a complete sentence. But what if we move that line break? The old man, the boat. And suddenly this sentence begins to make sense as a sentence. This is not a sentence about an old man. This is a sentence about older people, the old as opposed to the young, manning a boat or operating a boat. So put another way, this sentence means the elderly operate the boat. The old man the boat. And now it makes sense. This is an example of what we call a garden path sentence. Reading it and moving through the sentence, we understand it one way and we get to the end of the sentence and it leaves us stranded. We don't understand what it means. The old man, we understand as a unit, as a noun. It's an old man. And we're not reading the word man as a verb, which it is in this sentence. So placing the line break here does not offer clarity because we still read the old man as article, adjective, noun instead of article, noun, verb. The old man, the boat. So line breaks can provide clarity or they can sow confusion. And if we rewrite this line so that the meaning becomes more clear, then something is lost. It loses its rhythm. It loses its it loses the playfulness of the confusion that it might have. So let's look at this quatrain. This is a quatrain I wrote just for the purpose of illustrating this phenomenon. They looked out over the sea, turtles, and across the beach, balls, and gazed up at the sky, rockets that exploded overhead. Now, each of these lines, except for the last, is enjambed, but it might not seem that way immediately. They looked out over the sea. We might read that as a self-enclosed line, an end-stopped line. And it's only until after the line break, when we get to turtles, we realize we're talking about sea turtles and not the sea. And the same with the beach. And we looked across the beach. And it's only until we get to the next line that we realize we're talking about beach balls and not the beach. And the same with the sky. It's only until we get to the final line that we realize we're talking about skyrockets and not the sky. Now, we could move the line breaks so that this quatrain is more clear. And it would read like this. They looked out over the sea turtles and across the beach balls and gazed up at the skyrockets that exploded overhead. Both of these quatrains have the same words, but each becomes a completely different poem just by moving the line breaks. The line breaks themselves, I'm suggesting, have meaning or meanings. The playfulness of the double meanings created in the first set of line breaks is replaced by a clarity of imagery in the second set. Each quatrain might say the same thing, but they do something different. And I think this is an illustration of how line breaks can create or alter meaning. And it's something to be aware of when we're writing our own work, our own poems, because we want our work to be clear to our readers and to our listeners. So this quality of words having more than one meaning is called polysemy. Polysemy means many meanings. And as we have seen, a line break can create or emphasize polysemy. And this can be a playful tool that enhances the fun of the poem and generate puns, or it can be a source of unintended confusion if used poorly. Going back to these two quatrains, I don't have an opinion much if one is better than the other, only that each one is doing something very different and therefore means something very different. So here's another example. Look at this tercet. She was so angry she could see red, maples being bulldozed and buried, tombs being dug up and opened. And if we move those line breaks, it's a very different expression. She was so angry she could see red maples being bulldozed and buried tombs being dug up and opened. In this first version of this tercet, the somewhat cliched expression of being angry enough to see red forces us to read that first line a certain way. And so red refers to the state of being angry rather than referring to the maples in the second line. And that second line we read as maples being bulldozed and buried. And so the word buried seems to refer to the fate of those maple trees. In this next version, we no longer are led to consider the old cliche of seeing red as a meaning, a way of expressing anger. She was angry she could see red maples, and now red seems to refer to the maples rather than to her anger. And red maples are a specific kind of maple tree, and they're being bulldozed. And now the word buried no longer seems to refer to the ultimate fate of the maple trees, but now it seems to describe the kind of tombs that we're talking about, buried tombs being dug up and opened. So where we place the line breaks in this tercet changes the meaning of the lines or the way that we read them, and something very different happens. It becomes a very different way of expressing these words. Now, all the words are the same and they're in the same order, but the line break really changes the way that we read them. And so when we're composing a poem and we're deciding where to place our line breaks, I think these are some questions that we want to ask ourselves. What do I want the poem to say? What do I want the poem to do? How do I want the poem to sound? And can I place the line breaks so the poem accomplishes all of these aims? And so, sometimes you can accomplish all of your aims and sometimes you can't. It's sort of like apartment hunting. Like you might either get 3 bedrooms or ensuite laundry, but not both. But these are questions I think that are important to ask ourselves during the composition of a poem or even the editing of a poem, because certainly those line breaks can change at any stage in the development of a poem, whether it's first draft or final edit. There's always a way that a line break can change how the poem works. And again, we're going to pause here for questions. And I understand that there's a lot more questions here, and so I'm going to scan them very quickly. Someone wants to know what my favorite poetry books are because the line breaks are so strong. I will answer that, I think, towards at the end. Is there an opinion or guideline for what kind of word best ends an enjambed line? I will say no, and it depends on the text. It depends on the situation, but we can talk more about that later. Do I think em dashes can work as a pause at the end of a line? Sure, M dashes can work as a pause at the end of a line, or they can work in the middle of a line and create a caesura. Can you comment on using a space instead of a punctuation for a caesura? That's a matter of preference. We can certainly talk about that at the end. What about indentations? We can get to that. All right, I think I will stop those there. I'll stop those questions there, and we'll come back to these questions later. And I'll just check the chat window to make sure that we're on schedule. I'll check the time. All right, let's move on, shall we? So here is a poem by Salima Hill called Visiting the Zoo. And it reads like this. The tall giraffes can never sit. Their names are Valerie and Gwendolyn. I am their tall reticulated son. This is our sand and hay. Follow our gold stripped holy Tassili, blonde swallowtails, hares, a little milk. You are a good girl. He will never know. You are in love with someone else, not him. And that's the whole poem. It's a very short poem. So what is this poem about, or what does it do? And these sort of are two different things. And what enhancement of meaning, or what meaning period, is lost without these line breaks? I'll try to answer the first set of questions here. What is this poem about, or what does it do? This poem is about giraffes at the zoo, and in particular, two giraffes named Valerie and Gwendolyn and their son, who is the speaker of this poem. He's describing their enclosure. And then there's this mysterious statement at the end. And what does it do? Before we get to what it does, let's look at what this poem looks like without line breaks. The tall giraffes can never sit. Their names are Valerie and Gwendolyn. I am their tall reticulated son. This is our sand and hay. Follow our gold strip to holy Tassili, blonde swallowtails, hares, a little milk. You are a good girl. He will never know you are in love with someone else, not him. It sounds different. There's something different there. And if we come back to what it looks like and what it sounds like with the line breaks in place, remember what we said earlier about line breaks breaking up reading and creating pacing and slowing us down. And there's a lot of that happening in this poem with these line breaks. There are six end stop lines in a row. The tall giraffes can never sit. Their names are Valerie and Gwendolyn. I am their tall reticulated son. This is our sand and hay. Follow our gold stripped holy Tassili, blonde swallowtails, hares, a little milk. You are a good girl. Medial caesura here. He will never know. Ambiguous to the ear, enjambment that could sound like an end stop line. You are in love with someone else, not him. Terminal caesura at the end. What is this list of end stop lines doing? It's creating a very slow, specific litany of images that are connected as much by form as they are by context. And so combined with some of the imagery here, gold strip, holy Tassili, swallowtails, a little milk, there's it eventually builds a kind of spiritual feeling. that this list of of individual statements, the tall giraffes can never sit, their names are Valerie and Gwendolyn, I am their tall reticulated son, this is our sand and hay. It reads a bit maybe like a manifesto or a statement of existence, or perhaps like a religious litany. And the imagery of gold strips and the speech of Holy Tassili emphasize this reading in this poem. And I think it works quite well in that regard. And that sense of sort of one emphatic statement after another, creating a litany, is lost if we just read it as a paragraph without these line breaks. The line breaks slow us down, and they create a mood, they create a feeling that is accentuated by the imagery in the poem. If we compare that to the first stanza of The Kingfisher by Amy Clampett, and here we have just on the slide, the word screaming should be read as belonging to the end of the line before it. That's not a line by itself. So let's read how this goes. The first stanza of The Kingfisher by Amy Clampett. In a year the nightingales were said to be so loud, they drowned out slumber, and peafowl strolled screaming beside the ruined nunnery. Through the long evening of a dazzled pub crawl, the halcyon color portholed by those eye spots stunning tapestry, upsetting the pastoral nightfall with amazement's opening. Well, this whole stanza seems to function almost the exact opposite way of the Salima Hill poem that we just looked at. Instead of a list of end-stopped lines sort of creating that litany, what we have are successive enjambed lines that creates a sense of syntactic unity and rhythmic flow, with a sustained narrative cohesion that makes the final end stop of that last line more emphatic when it occurs, allowing for a heightened sense of space and contrast before the next stanza, which reads, months later, intermission in a pub on 55th Street, found one of them still breathless, the other quizzical, acting the Philistine, puncturing Stravinsky. Tell me, what was that racket in the orchestra about? Hauling down the firebird harum scarum like a kite, a burnished breathing wreck that didn't hurt at all. We go back to that first line, or that first stanza. Again, look here at how each of these lines ends with an enjambment until that last line. It winds like a river, it keeps flowing like a river, it goes and goes, or it unspools like kite string until we come to that final end stop line, which, because there are a series of enjambed lines before it, that final end stop line feels all the more end stopped. It's emphasized because it's contrasted to the series of enjambed lines that come before it. So that space between the two stanzas, when we get to that next stanza that begins months later, we can better feel that time having passed. Those months exist in that space between those two stanzas, because that final end stop in the first stanza feels so emphatic after all those enjambments that we can almost feel time stop and then start up again at the beginning of this second stanza, months later, intermission in a pub on 55th Street. And I don't want to get to that next poem just yet. Or perhaps I do. Yeah, let's just go into this last poem and then we'll end with a Q&A. So here's a very short poem called Origin of the Marble Forest by Gregory Orr. Pay very close attention here. This poem, despite having only 5 lines, has it all. It has a self-enclosed line. It has enjambment. It has different kinds of caesure and end stops. So, Origin of the Marble Forest by Gregory Orr. Childhood dotted with bodies. Let them go. Let them be ghosts. No, I said. make them stay, make them stone. And much like the Salima Hill poem a few moments ago, I think we can really see what's going on here if we just take a moment to look at this very short poem without its line breaks. So here's Origin of the Marble Forest without line breaks. Childhood dotted with bodies, let them go, let them be ghosts. No, I said, make them stay, make them stone. Without the white space created by the line breaks here, and indeed the spaces between the lines, which emphasize the line breaks, or some of them, a lot of the meaning of this poem becomes lost. And the pacing and the deliberate sort of reflective tone of this poem is lost. It's the line breaks that create that tone, that create the space in which that reflection can occur. Childhood dotted with bodies, a sentence fragment with an end stop. We're meant to pause and reflect on that line. It's even given space before the next line picks up. Let them go. Let them be ghosts. Let them go. And then there's a medial caesura. Let them, enjambment, be ghosts. Another blank line, lots of white space after that end stop. No, I said, make them stay, make them stone. And two lines in a row with an end stop, both with a medial caesura, or that, well, the caesura after no, you could that line is so short you could argue that it is an initial caesura perhaps. But there are so many opportunities to pause and reflect and think in this short little poem that's one of the things that creates the tone and the mood of this poem, combined of course with its imagery and diction and rhythm. But a lot of that rhythm is created by the caesurae and the line breaks at the ends of the lines, whether they're enjambed or not. And of course, all of that white space. But it also creates a very clear sense that there's more than one voice here. There's at least two, perhaps three voices here. And that depends on who you think is speaking that first line. Childhood dotted with bodies. Is that the same person speaking as the one who says, let them go, let them be ghosts? Or is it the same person who is saying, no, I said, make them stay, make them stone? Or is it a third voice in the conversation? It's open for debate, I think. But certainly line breaks allow us to read more than one voice here. And I think that there's a debate or an argument being made in this poem is part of its strength as well. This is a poem about needing to let something go and not wanting to let something go. And there are things about Gregory Orr's biography that accentuate the meaning of this poem. And I won't get into that. And if you're curious about Gregory Orr's life, I urge you to look up more about him. He's a fantastic writer of very short poems, and this is a good example of his technique. But we can see almost all the kinds of line breaks that I've been talking about in this workshop at work in this one very short poem with only 5 lines. And they do all the things that we've said these line breaks should do. They slow us down. They enhance the meaning. They create rhythm. They create pacing. They allow us to linger on words and emphasize them. And I think it's a very powerful, powerful poem. Not only for its imagery, but also for the way that it uses the space and the pauses that the line breaks and caesurae provide. And so I think we should come now to, I think we've got about 10 minutes left in the workshop. So I want to take that 10 minutes to make sure that I answer the rest of the questions that I said I would ask. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. All right. And I am going to open the Q&A window and try and work through some of these questions for you. Okay, I'll start near the beginning here. So an anonymous attendee asks, when you're writing poetry, do you add line breaks as you go and then edit it all later? Or do you just write paragraphs of what you're feeling and then go back and reformat it with the line breaks and stanzas, etc.? I certainly write with line breaks from the get-go. From the very first draft of a poem, I'm usually writing line breaks into it. They might not be the line breaks that I keep in the final draft of the poem, but they're certainly there because I tend to, I've been writing poetry long enough. And as I've said, the line is the basic building block of building a poem. So I tend to write my poems line by line rather than sentence by sentence or word by word. I'm thinking in terms of the line and where to end lines and how to end lines or how to join lines. And I think that's something to consider as well, that line breaks are not just how we separate lines, but they're also how we join them and how we connect them. So I'm always thinking of these things right from the very first draft of a poem. Line by line is how I write, not sentence by sentence or word by word. The next question is, I would like your thoughts on punctuation in general and the use of the comma in particular, especially at the end of a line. And this is a question I get a lot in poetry workshops. I think oftentimes people are given very sort of prescriptive instruction about what to do with punctuation at the ends of lines in a poem. And there, let me put you all at ease right away. There is no law that you must obey about the use of punctuation at the end of a line. Many poets don't use commas at the end of a line. And this is sort of certainly something that became very popular in the mid 20th century, sort of as those early modernist poems sort of gave way to the next generation of modernist poets who sort of were prefiguring the first wave of postmodernist poets. But that sort of mid-century modernism in poetry, a lot of the time, the trend was, or the fashion was, to write your poem line by line, as though each line was sort of a unit of thought or a unit of breath. And so instead of punctuation, like commas, the line breaks would become your punctuation. And this was one fashion of writing poetry, but it's certainly not the way to write poetry or the only way to write poetry. And there's nothing wrong with it. But it's not a rule that needs to be followed. And I in fact am a fan of punctuation. And I often use it purposefully. I often use it, even though I have line breaks, I will put punctuations where they should be grammatically in my poems, and that's my own preference. And sometimes I use punctuation excessively, or in novel ways, or in playful ways, because I'm subverting or undercutting what punctuation might supposed to do in a poem or in a composition, and I'm maybe doing that on purpose. So that is my answer to that. Could you please talk about the different poetic inflections of creating line break versus placing a forward slash in a line? And I think what this question is about is sometimes in a poetic line, instead of breaking the line and going to the next line, a poet will place a slash mark in the middle of the line to suggest a division or a caesura or some kind of verbal chasm from one word to the next. And that's a technique that that works to create, I think, a caesura that has extra strength. That's creating an extra strength caesura, a caesura that might feel as that it has all the power of a line break, but still allowing the visual connection of the two halves of the line to remain. It's a very visual way of breaking up a line to put a slash in there. And in fact, in a lot of my recent work, I've sort of switched from using a slash in these situations to using a mark that they call a vertical bar, and you'll find it on your keyboard above the backslash. If you shift backslash, you get that vertical bar, and I've been using that to sort of create more emphatic caesurae within a line. And there's no right or wrong. It's all technique, and it all depends on how you use it and whether or not it works. The next question is about using the capital S in the Wallace Stevens poem, and I've addressed that one already. The next question is, how do prose poems function in terms of line breaks? Can they contain caesurae? How does one's reading of a prose poem differ from reading regular prose? My opinion of prose poems is that they're sort of a different animal altogether. All of these things exist on a spectrum rather than sort of in sort of taxonomical silos. And prose poems are called prose poems because they function in some ways as prose, and they function in other ways as poetry. And I think it depends on who's writing the prose poem or how you want to write the prose poem. Can they contain caesurae? Of course they can. Every emphatic comma can be a caesurae, or especially if you want to put in a backslash or some other punctuation mark, an em dash can create a caesurae in a prose poem. And remember, dashes separate, hyphens join. What are some of your favorite books because the line breaks are so strong? I'll come back to that one if there's time. What's the difference between what do I want the poem to say and what do I want the poem to do? For example, going back to the Salima Hill poem, what does the poem say? The poem says, in the voice of a young giraffe, these are some things about me and the giraffes in my enclosure, and some imagery about where we live, and I'm telling you just a little bit about my life. That's what the poem says in the voice of a giraffe. What does the poem do? The poem creates a sense of spiritual mystery. The poem functions as a litany of personal statements. The poem ends with a mysterious statement about a love affair that may or may not be illicit. And these are things that the poem does in contrast to what it says. And these things, of course, work in tandem and they overlap quite a bit. But there can be a very big difference between what a poem says and what a poem does. And when there is a very strongly implied difference between what a poem is saying and what a poem is doing, that can create a kind of dramatic irony that can be quite effective. The next question is, how do line breaks impact metered poems where a rhythm is also being established by other means? And I would say they enhance it or they accentuate it. Certainly, if you are creating metered verse that is rising rhythm or falling rhythm, is specifically if it's like a anapestic or iambic kind of thing, um, you can accentuate that rhythm by if you have 3 or 4 lines that are all relatively the same length, and then a relatively shorter line that you broke early, followed by 3 or 4 lines that are relatively the same length. That short line where you put the line break in early is going to stand out. It's going to have emphasis. So you can think about rhythm in poems on different levels. There's like a sort of the line, the rhythm within the line, which is sort of iambic pentameter or whatever, da 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 da. And then there's the rhythm created by line upon line upon line upon line. And so there's 2 levels of rhythm happening in a poem with metered verse. It's the from word to word to word to word is the rhythm within the line, and then from line to line to line to line is the larger sort of macro rhythm in a poem. And those things can work in concert with one another. And finally, the last question here: what are some of your favorite poetry books? Because the line breaks are so strong. Oh, I've left this question to the end because I was trying to think of some examples to give you. I'm a big fan of Amy Clampett, uh, particularly because her line breaks are so strong. And if we only looked at 2 stanzas of the Kingfisher today, but if you guys go back and read that whole poem and just spend time sort of reflecting on what she's doing with line breaks, that's a whole class, that's a whole workshop in and of itself. Um, I I love what Gregory Orr and Salima Hill do with line breaks, which is why I included them in this workshop. So I will guide you back to their work. The American poet James Dickey does marvelous things with line breaks. Certainly, Ted Hughes does marvelous things with line breaks. But a contemporary of Hughes, who is much lesser known, is actually one of my great favorites. And so I'll usually take any opportunity to give a plug for a man whose name was Peter Redgrove, who I think is a marvelous poet and an incredible lyrical technician, and not as well known as some of his contemporaries, but certainly every bit as good, if not better. And maybe I'll leave it at that. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this workshop here today. I certainly hope you got something out of it. And I'd like to thank Wild Writers again for inviting me to share my thoughts on line breaks with you. I'd like to point out that this is only scratching the surface. There's so much more to talk about when it comes to line breaks, but we only had an hour. And I'd like to thank my dear friend Chris Banks for being the MC for tonight. And with that, and again, to thank you all for being here, I'd like to turn things back over to Chris Banks.
Okay, thanks, Paul. You've given us terrific insight into a poet's need to pay close attention to line breaks tonight, both in how they look and how they sound in contemporary poetry. I love what you said about line breaks creating pacing and even creating meaning, the importance of caesura. There was lots of information value in your slides. In closing, I want to remind viewers that Paul's books are available for purchase online from Wordsworth Books in Waterloo. The link to this online ordering is in the Q&A window of your screen or can be found at wildwriters.ca. I hope you've enjoyed the workshop as much as I did. Thanks, Paul, and thanks to everyone.